Cumberland, Rhode Island, that seemed to catapult us to the farm. But about 3 years before my mother even discovered the farm, and before any of us had any notion of leaving where we were living, my father came home with a puppy one day, an African Basenji, a very rare dog, beautiful, beautiful animal. And my mother swept her up into her arms, and she said, "This is a very special dog. She deserves an equally special name." And she closed her eyes. I'll never forget this. She's holding this little puppy to her bosom and just closed her eyes and tilted her head back toward the cosmos. And when she brought her head back down, she opened her eyes and she said, "Bathsheba."
Wow.
And we were just little kids, and we didn't know the biblical reference. We'd never heard the name before. It meant nothing to us. And so we said, "Okay, Sheba." We just abbreviated it immediately, and she became Sheba. But her official name was Bathsheba. And
wow.
And she died a gruesome death in my care. And it altered me. It broke my spirit to see my precious dog die the way that she did. And I just didn't get over it. It changed me. It changed me. And that was one of the things that my mother said, "We've got to get out of here. We've just got to get out of here. My kids can't play with their own animals in their own yard, and this is happening and that's happening." And there's this whole series of very unfortunate events that happened over the course of about a year that convinced my mother that she wanted to take her children out of the suburbs and to move to a place in the country. And it was in June of 1970 that she found the farm. And my father was away on a business trip, and she emptied our family bank account to put earnest money down on that farm to hold it until he got back. Left enough money in the account for milk and bread in his absence, and that was it. Because she was determined that we were going to buy the old Arnold estate in Harrisville, Rhode Island. And believe me when I tell you, ghosts were not on the radar, okay? My mother was a student of history, and she had just stumbled upon one of the original colonial homes left in America. This house, as it stands now, was completed in 1736, 40 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
Wow.
It was originally deeded land that was surveyed by John Smith, the John Smith, in 1680. So it is truly an exceptional, extraordinary piece of property, and a beautiful home. And eight generations of one extended family lived and died in that home prior to our arrival. We were literally the first people that ever lived in that farmhouse that weren't somehow related through blood or marriage to the original builders of the home.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, quite a
That is
history.
amazing. Yeah, that is amazing. Now, did Bathsheba Sherman, did she live adjacent to the property, or did she actually live on the property? How did that come about?
Well, there's not a whole lot of historical documentation about Bathsheba. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't even know where that came from. Because I'm like spun out on caffeine right now. They say yawning is actually because you don't have enough oxygen in your brain, not because you're tired. So, pardon me. And Bathsheba Sherman did not actually live at the Arnold estate. She lived with her husband, Judson Sherman, at the Sherman farm, which was about a mile away from our property as the crow flies through the woods. But she did have some attachment to that house. And we were told by the town historian at the time, who was in his 90s when we met him, that she died when he was 10 years old. He was born in 1875. She died in 1885. And he didn't have a nice word to say about her. And he told my mother that she had been accused of killing a child in that house. And I don't know if it was her child, or if she was babysitting, or, caring for one of the Arnold children. There's no documentation around that. What little there was, my mother found in archives up in Worcester, Massachusetts, when she began doing research on the property, when she realized it was haunted and she didn't think it was just happenstance that the ghosts were passing through, that they were somehow attached to that property, and she wanted to know why. So it was in the second year that we lived there that she began in earnest an attempt to do historical research on the property. But Bathsheba Sherman was not an Arnold. She was born of the union of the Fair and Taft families, both of which were original colonists who followed Roger Williams from the Massachusetts Bay Colony down to the colony he established that became Rhode Island. They were wealthy families, and their names are all over Brown University. I mean, they were very much involved with the building of what became the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. And the reason that the state is named that was because the only way that Roger Williams could claim the property that he negotiated with the Wampanoag Indians for around Narragansett Bay and surrounding environs was to deed out vast tracts of land to families that followed him from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so, 2,000-3,000 acres at a time were deeded to these people, and those actually became the boundaries of the state to the north and to the west, to hold the colony of Connecticut at bay and to keep the Massachusetts Bay Colony from intruding and, taking area around Narragansett Bay. So the original property for the farmhouse was deeded in 1680 to the Richardson family. And then it became the Arnold estate through marriage over the course of about the next 100 years. But Bathsheba was dead long. Let me say this: the offending spirit in the house that was targeting my mother was dead long before Bathsheba Sherman was even born. And the reason that Mrs. Warren made her the villainess and kind of tagged her as the culprit was because the first time that she came to our house, and she came to our house not because my mother sought her out. My mother had no idea who this couple was that was standing at our kitchen door the night before Halloween in 1973. She just let them in because it was cold outside and she was a gracious hostess. And they seemed lost. But it was actually Keith and Carl Johnson who had come to the house a couple of months before. And nobody understands why they knew to come to the house. They said that my mother called them, and she said, I never called anybody. So there seems to be some kind of spirit finagling going on there as well. But they're the ones that informed Ed and Lorraine Warren at a seminar at the University of Rhode Island in September of 1973 when they were doing a college tour, and then told them where we were and who we were. And then they waited until the night before Halloween to come to the house, and Mrs. Warren walked into the house And she walked over to our big black stove and put her hand down on the corner of it and covered her eyes. And she said, I sense a malignant spirit in this house. Her name is Bathsheba. And so that kind of stunned my mother because my mom knew of the history of Bathsheba Sherman, who lived right in the area, and her connections to the house. And so she thought that that was fascinating that Lorraine would pull that name out of, virtually out of the ether. God bless you. Um, and so in the case files of the Warrens, Mrs. Warren really compiled those for the most part, and she just blamed everything on Bathsheba, but Bathsheba was not the offending spirit in the house.
But do you guys have any idea of the name of the offending spirit? I mean, is that something that you would have wanted to know, or?
Well, none of us are ever going to know for certain, not in this lifetime anyway, because it wasn't the nature of our relationship with the spirits. None of them ever walked up to us and said, hello, my name was, or my name is. My mother tried to, just by process of elimination, by tombstones and what was inscribed on them, kind of put the pieces of this very elaborate puzzle together. And she was only working with, a fraction of the pieces that actually exist in terms of putting the whole story together. So she was always working at a disadvantage. But she did scour the record rooms at the town hall and the town library, and used Keach's History of Burrowville, which is a voluminous, detailed treatise of the families that inhabited the villages of Burrowville, including Harrisville, back in the 17 and 1800s. The town historian now, Pat Mertens, has worked tirelessly to compile all the bizarre deaths that took place in Burrowville. They weren't just at our house. There were, many very strange, anomalous, bizarre things that occurred in that town. There was like a pallor of death over that town. There were many, many haunted homes there. It certainly wasn't just ours. Ours is just the most famous one.
Wow. Is there an event that you would call that's paranormal, that stands out, that occurred in your house that you would absolutely never forget?
There are a number of events that happened in the house that I will absolutely never forget. The first and foremost being the night that the Warrens showed up with a caravan of, vehicles and a priest and a medium and video crew, audio crew. I mean, it was just like a whole pile of people just showed up at our house, and my father was livid. He didn't want anything to do with any of this. And it took Ed and the priest about an hour to talk him into allowing them to do a seance. And Mrs. Warren was very lucky that night that she was a woman and that my father is a gentleman, because she said something to him that had she been a man, she would have most certainly paid for. But at one point she looked up at him and kind of growled at him and said, if you love your wife, you'll let us do this. And he was furious, absolutely furious, had to be physically removed from the room. The tension in the house that night was so thick you could literally cut it with a knife. It was absolutely irresponsible of the medium to conduct a seance in a house where 4 of the 5 little children were still in the house. Only my sister Nancy. Yeah. Only my sister Nancy was spending the night with a friend, but the other 4 of us were there, and it was a disaster. It almost cost my mom her life. the the medium began conjuring the spirits. I consider it spiritual malpractice to kick open wide